I'm setting the recording real fast. Thank you. Mary, yeah, Mary Jo, sorry, Mary Jo.
I did just notice one more reference to peace, which is at the top of 485. And
Okay.
that, the bottom of that first hanging paragraph there, but that paragraph has to do with Athena. I mean, they're ready to kill more people, and Athena says, hold back, stop killing, let them go. So the peace seems to be, let's not continue killing, which is a good thing.
Yeah, good. But let me ask a question. Pick up on what Jonathan said. Does anybody have an opinion about Jonathan's notion that, well, why doesn't Odysseus come home, say, look, I'm back. No need to pursue Penelope anymore. We're still married. Now take your things and go. Kit and then Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's not a pursuit, and this came out in the discussion already. It's a pursuit for power and rulership. It's not necessarily a pursuit for Penelope's hand, so it doesn't really matter if she's married or not. I think Odysseus sees it, and probably rightly so, as a group of people who would vie for power over all of Ithaca, and he needs to, as rightful king of Ithaca, probably feels he needs to destroy them to prevent.
Yeah, go ahead. Somebody, whoever was. Go ahead, Laura. Yeah.
I was going to say that also it was, there were offenses that were perpetrated by these suitors, and that would be things like against the household, but against the women. And, and I think there's something about justice in this whole, the whole weighing of who, would determine who died. I mean, in points in, Odysseus had that, weighing, did you die or were you complicit? And I think that's part of this whole picture as to why the suitors had to be handled. Yeah,
good. And remember, the first 4 chapters of the book were about what was going on at home. It was the home front, and it was Telemachus. It was the suitors. It was the offenses that they were committing, and we hear about them over and over again. Mary, go ahead.
Well, there is one point before the Odysseus starts fighting with the suitors where one of them, and we talked about this just a second ago a little bit, I guess it's Eurymachus, goes up and says, Odysseus, you have a right to feel aggrieved. We'll recompense you for your losses. We'll do this, we'll do that, and we'll identify essentially the suitors who are particularly bad. And he says in words and substance, hell no, we're going to fight this out. And that's what we see over and over and over, including in the Iliad, where there's a possibility of resolving it through what appears to be the way people resolve blood disputes, which is payment, and it's rebuffed. And I just think there must be something in the notion of a real hero that he doesn't take the payment. I mean, Achilles didn't accept recompense, and we don't think lesser of him because he was being truly heroic in his rage. And so I think there's an element of that in what Odysseus is doing here.
Good. Yeah, I like that. Anybody else want to come in on that? Gary, yeah.
Well, the thing that was always lacking at the in the Iliad is a sense of closure. I mean, there is no one really felt that fall of Troy really seemed to end anything other than the fall of Troy. I mean, there are still a lot of issues, and as such, I think Odysseus comes in here at the end of the Odyssey not as a relief pitcher but as a closer. There's a sense of finality in so many of these things here, none the least of which you got the gods in alignment for a change. I mean, whatever happened on the Scamander plain there in front of Troy, okay, that was worked out between the Trojans and the Achaeans. The gods were never reconciled to. They never signed off on any of this, okay? Here you got that imprimatur from Athena saying peace. I mean, she gives her good housekeeping seal of approval on the deal, and basically it ends as such. And that's I guess that's what I appreciate the most about this is that, there's a sense of finality here. Okay, that Athena as Zeus's representative is okay. The war's over now.
Well, I don't. So we could have a discussion now on which analogy did you like better that Gary gave us? The relief pitcher, the closer, or the good housekeeper seal of approval? My vote is for the closer. Odysseus comes in as a closer instead of the relief pitcher. It's really good. And so what, Gary, I'm going to interpret what I think you mean, that he comes in as a closer to achieve the justice that's satisfying to him and Telemachus and his house and his honor.
I think that's very true. And to take it one step further, okay, thing that had always been lacking, okay, in the Iliad, okay, is the sense of trying to reconcile a lot of the pain or sorrow that preceded that story. Okay, here in probably the most moving thing of both sagas, okay, there's a genuine sense of reconciliation, not just between father and son as far as Telemachus and Odysseus is concerned, but also because of Laertes and Odysseus. So it's across the generations that there's a sense of accord here that always seemed to be sorely lacking.
Okay, on the other side of this, that is, we've been talking about Odysseus and his family. On the other side of this, someone suggested, I think it was Kit, that the suitors this was just as much a power move, or maybe even more so, and might we even call that a coup? And the question would be, could Odysseus leave a coup go unresolved? Here you seem to have the nobles of Ithaca banding together to overthrow the household of Odysseus. And so how do you resolve that in the culture from which they come? I can't see them sitting down across the table from one another and making some kind of resolution. And I think that's part of what the opening chapters 1 to 4, were all about. Let me just stop with that. I don't want to talk too much if anybody wants to pick up on that. Kit, did you want to follow up with that?
I just wanted to add that it kind of in contrast to the Iliad, where we see the gods taking sides or playing out their own disputes using our mortals. Here, the suitors, they don't have any god kind of pulling for them or,
Right.
We have gods, Poseidon's wrath and all of this against Odysseus, but, in various parts of his journey. But in general, I don't think any god thinks that he should be overthrown as king of Ithaca.
Yeah, very good. That's so. In other words, Kit, what I'm hearing you say is the absence of a god lining up with the suitors is an argument that the suitors are committing an injustice in their world. Good, thank you. Jonathan, what else?
Yeah, just to build on what Kit just said, that really set off a light bulb in my head. Odysseus's return was foretold by the gods, right? You will get home. Did the gods foretell that he was going to slaughter everybody, or is that his agency as a human being?
Anybody want to pick up on that? Do you recall, Mary? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think it was book 2. There were various prophecies and maybe even bird readings along with that, which basically told the plot line of the birds always, the plot line of the story. And it was repeated at several points by prophets and there's got to be a better word than bird readers, but that's all I can come up with right now, that this was going to be the way it would play out and that the suitors would meet their doom and Odysseus would return.
Laura?
I was going to say the very similar thing.
Yeah. And what about Tiresias? Tiresias at the opening to Hades and meets him. He anticipates that there's going to be war when he returns. So it seems that it's all there in the background. Maybe one more thing before we end. What about the reunion of Odysseus and Penelope? How, I was about to say something that it wouldn't have sounded right. What did you, were you satisfied with their reunion? Laura, go ahead.
I was. I mean, I have to say that as Penelope, I would have thought she might have been ticked at him for faking it for all that time while he was there at home and didn't share it with her. But they jump over that, and then they allow it to develop, or Homer allows it to develop slowly enough, because it's been a long time. So you couldn't just quickly recognize and then go, oh. So I thought it satisfied me. I thought that was a good, except for the part that she wasn't a little bit angry. I don't know why, but.
Because she should have given him a little something, right? I mean, should have, come on. It's been 10 years.
Yeah.
Anyone else? From what Laura said, I would add to that the theme of recognition that has run throughout the Odyssey, and I think that the book would have been inconsistent without some kind of slow reveal of Odysseus to Penelope. Or if I put it a different way, that the slow reveal to Penelope is consistent with the theme of recognition that we have seen running through the book. I think I like it, saying it better that way. Scott, you were also going to come in on this.
Well, kind of differing from the group here. I saw that, I understood that, but then I also thought, she was crying every night and Odysseus was crying every night, and it seemed like the reunion lacked a little of emotion, and it was almost like, okay, I'm here, this is me, but I'm going to go off and have this other adventure and I'll come back later, so it seemed almost a little perfunctory. No, I don't know. I'm trying to think of the right word, but it was
sterile.
Yeah, like kind of not cool. I don't know. I'll think of the word, but it wasn't. Yeah.
Okay, you would have preferred to see. So Scott, we're hearing a little bit of the romantic coming out of you. You would have preferred to see, a long embrace at least.
Yeah, you would think, because in a way, in my mind, I thought about it, because I thought of it from a literature perspective, was almost as if in each of their minds there was this home, and it no longer exists, and they have to kind of reestablish, and it kind of gets to that theme about almost a Godfather-like theme of reestablish the family or whatever, and so the best moments are in their past, and that's the way they see it, and they almost have to like start it over again. Wow. In a way, the way I saw that. Yeah.
Oh wow, that one. Yeah, Gary, go ahead.
I don't know. I kind of like the reunion. Okay, them getting back together again. I thought that was very realistic. I mean, it's been 20 years, and they're both clearly very much in love with each other. It's just that they don't know each other anymore.
Well,
okay,
yeah.
And I mean, where do you begin? I mean, what would be a good way of breaking the ice here? Okay, I mean, there's the heroic way. There's the Achilles way, where you just drag her off to the great rooted bed. Okay, but you know what? It just, there's more of a quiet resignation. Like, okay, let's begin again. And I kind of appreciated that more than the artificiality of him kind of trotting out a laundry list of all the glories, and boy, do I got a story to tell you, and I think,
would he tell her all the stories?
Well, I think there would be certain things edited out of that, yeah. But I think there's more of a quiet resignation that, you know what, our love and what holds us together here is stronger than any of the things that we've gone through, either at home here with you suitors or me overseas with Hector and company.
Very good. Okay, maybe a last, Kit, did you want to come in on this?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it seems a little perfunctory or cold or short to us, I think, because we don't hear all of the stories that Odysseus tells Penelope. I mean, we hear that he told her everything that happened, and we get kind of a summary, but so often in the Odyssey, we hear the entire stories again when people are telling each other stories, and here we don't. Right. It's just like a short passage. So I think even though we know that, okay, he's told her all these stories, because we don't hear them in the response, it feels a little less significant of a reunion and than it might otherwise.
Yeah, I like the part that Gary, that you brought up, that it's been 20 years. And how do you fill that gap? You probably don't fill it instantaneously, right? That gap needs to be filled more slowly than what a year apart would do to a relationship. So the 20 years, I mean, he leaves in his 20s and he comes back in his 40s. That's quite a difference. We know that threshold of, some of us know that threshold of 40. You know, you cross that one. I don't know about you, but I think 40 was a bigger number than 50 for me, and now even 60. Never mind. Okay. You know, they've crossed that threshold of 40, and you know, they're clearly more mature people than when he left. Mary, what else?
Well, on a slightly different note, the part of the book that I found jarring and a little upsetting is the way he treated Laertes when he came back, because at that point it seemed unnecessary. Mm-hmm. So he tested Telemachus, he tested the swineherder, he tested Penelope, yada, yada, yada. But at that point, did he really need to test his aged father in that particular way, when it was clear that he was powerless in the situation, and that he had already had conversations with pretty much everybody else, so he already knew what the, you know, so to speak, lay of the land is. And that just seemed like he was doing it out of habit, if nothing else. What was the point of causing his elderly father to cry and feel bad? It made no sense at all to me, other than that was what Odysseus does. He tests people. That's a really good observation. Scott, what do you make of that?
Yeah, no, I guess all I could say is I agree. I thought it was cruel. It was like there's no reason for that, and like it's like someone who makes a joke. They think it's kind of funny themselves, but it's really not.
What? I do that all the time with my kids. Seems like you do too, Scott.
Yeah, we toughen them up a little bit.
Wow, this is really interesting. There's an unnecessary element here at the end of the story. Anybody else? Kit, go ahead.
I'm just thinking about, and we talked about this a little bit last time, just the theme of testing and challenging, and it almost seems held up as a value. I mean, Penelope tests Odysseus tests everybody. Odysseus is, you know, tested throughout. Like, is this a value of at least the Odysseus Penelope household? This need to test everybody at any possible juncture?
Mary Jo, yeah. Unmute.
I think that's a good question. You know, he's always had a reputation of being crafty and conniving, and somebody said at some point that this Odyssey was supposed to teach him that wasn't the way to act, but he continues to act that way. And with respect to Laertes, I was wondering, is there some purpose to this also, or is there some cultural, I'm the king now and I'm going to show my power to the previous king? Yeah, it didn't make any sense. But I still do, apart from this discussion, have the burning question of whether he changed during this Odyssey. And I just don't see that he's changed at all.
Oh, whether Odysseus changes. That's an interesting question. That's a good question that gets to, shall we say, the arc of the story. We could also ask along with that, is there any anything in the story that creates the expectation of change in Odysseus? Was it Scott? Were you going to respond to that?
Yeah, maybe to Mary Jo's comment, which I thought was really good, and I even reflected on that maybe a couple of weeks ago. Maybe it was last week, because we read this last week as well. And I was thinking about when Odysseus and Telemachus engaged the suitors, it was rageful. It was almost like Achilles when he's finally released on the Trojans. And it's almost, okay, so Achilles is rageful. He wasn't the smartest guy in the room, very good warrior, rageful, just tore through the Trojans, and he died in the end. But he never really changed. Through that whole story, he was just raging and raging and raging, no matter what. All these people dying around him, what for? And he's kind of causing some of that. And then Odysseus is almost too crafty for his own good. To the extent that he kind of bends fate, and he's able to get his way. But to get his way, he has to do some things that, at least maybe in my modern mores, might be thought as either unethical or just kind of like, outside of what one might try to do. And he never changes through the story in that way either. But he has to suffer kind of like Achilles because of that, but he never really fully learns. and there's always a God kind of, protecting one of these two and kind of helping them along the way to the end, but they never really quite change their character.
Okay. All right. Jonathan, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, no, I just think Scott's spot on. I was thinking that a better title for this last chapter is The Rage of Odysseus.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's been separate. What has he learned over the 20 years? That he's really pissed off. And he's really angry that he's been kept from home for so long. And so all that longing transforms, if there's any change, it transforms and articulates itself as him just literally, I envision the way this is described, literally Athena has to kind of hold him back physically and say, stop killing people, stop the slaying, stop the murdering. And because he's rageful. And the peace that she imposes isn't to forgive and forget. It's to somebody said earlier, it's just to stop killing. So the rage is still there.
Wow. Okay, let me ask a final question in light of what you are saying now. What's the value of this book? What does it, why do we keep reading it? Mary Jo?
During reading of the book, I could imagine people sitting around a campfire, listening to this story being recited, and it giving them hope to get through these trials of life. And so he got through this and that, and there were long periods where he was inconsolable, and somehow a God came and helped him, and something good happened. So just sort of a buck it up, it's going to all come out well in the end, sort of feeling for young people.
So the book could be, a source of inspiration, a motivation for people as they read it to keep pressing on, and also to, I'll leave that aside. Anyone else want to come in on that? Gary, yeah.
Looking back at after having read this 40 some years ago in college, I could see the value of rereading this repeatedly throughout your life. It's just like, there's a season for everything in your life. There's an Iliad season in your life, and there's an Odyssey season. There's a season where you basically go out and get what you want or what you need. And then there's the season like in the Odyssey where you have to figure out working your way through living with it now. Okay. And, it's this, it's this endless cycle of the two kind of trying to make peace with one another, or certainly reconcile their needs with each other. Okay, that's kind of my big takeaway from this.
Good, Mary.
I think what Gary said was beautiful, and it's about, on that point, you read at different points in your life because you're different people in the book, right? The first time I read it, I was more Telemachus. I think I probably skipped over the Penelope stage, and now I'm Laertes. But you sort of see it in different ways, right? And the importance of these structures, the importance of family, the importance of parents, all of these things, they too change over the course of a life. So I can see, again, like Mary Jo said, you can see sitting around the fire and people saying it, and how it would be deeply moving.
Very nice, Scott. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say 100% with Gary and Mary, both beautiful thoughts. And I reflected on something similar to what Gary said, but not as well. In that I was thinking, when you're a young person and you read this, and I read this maybe 40 years ago or whatever, I thought of it as an adventure. I mean, I read through it and I didn't really internalize the pain that Odysseus was going through. I didn't have a family, so I didn't think about what, this meant as the home and trying to protect the home and yearning to come back to the home. I didn't understand that. I thought it as one big adventure, and Odysseus is kind of having a fun time going through all these trials is what, almost like a Hercules sort of thing is the way I thought of it. But when you read it as an adult, you see it's almost like, hey, you're really not in control of your fate all the time. You can do what you can to make things go as well as you can. But it's almost like a Job sort of concept is, you can't argue with the gods. You can't, make it happen the way it's not going to happen, and in some sense you got to take what you get and endure and suffer through it. And then also the importance of, your family is so, I'm later in my career, but your family, you start having a family, you have a wife, and then you start having kids, and you're consumed with, how do I protect the family? And you can go to great lengths and time working and doing things that take you actually away from your family to do that.
Yeah.
And then you come home on the weekends or whenever, have a vacation, you say, gosh, this is really what I'm doing this all for, but I can't help it. I've got to do this because, and Odysseus is kind of facing that a little bit. He's got to go on these adventures away from the family. And he's kind of like, in a way, in order to do what he wants to do, be with his family, he's got to be away from them. It's kind of you don't understand that until you've
right
all of that, I guess.
Wow. That's all these comments are really, really good and interesting, that we read it as different people at different times in our lives. If we read this more than once, really nice comments and bringing this all together. That is that there are different seasons in our lives when we read the book, and when we read it, we might identify with it in different ways as we go through it. So it's still worth reading then, despite the distance between us and the time at which this book was written, not only the time, but also the space and the culture. It seems to be still worth reading. And one of those comments is that young Odysseus, when we read it as youngsters, maybe we were, sorry for this, it's going to be too obvious, maybe we were more like Stephen in the portrait of the young artist who is on our way, although I'm sure that none of you want to say you identify with Stephen, but I'm forced to, because every time I read it, there's my name right there on the page, so I'm forced to read it. So we should, let's transition to this, but anybody want, I don't want to cut anybody off too soon, if there's anything else that somebody wants to add to this. Kathy and Rita, I can see that you've logged on, but there's no video and no sound for you. Okay, we hope they can figure that out. So we ready for the transition to make the change from Homer, presumably, and the Odyssey of, around 1000 BCE to now 19th century Ireland and Europe, and now a young Stephen as our central character. Let me just start by asking, what are your initial impressions? We have first 2 chapters for today, right? I just want to make sure we're discussing the first 2 chapters. Good. So if anybody's read it before, we can't spoil anything for those who haven't. We have to limit ourselves only to the first 2 chapters in the book. And in doing so, let me ask your impressions. You're all readers without any doubt. I can, it's clear that you're readers. So here now we're reading a more contemporary work, relatively speaking. We're reading a novel. We're not reading an epic poem. We have a narrator that and an author that is known in history. So there's all kinds of literary questions that we can raise in reading this book as well that are more difficult to raise when reading something like the Odyssey or the Iliad, because we're not quite sure of the authorship. We're not quite sure of its composition and all of those kinds of things. And there's quite a distance in culture between us and that book. Whereas this one, though there's still a difference, 100 years or more, nonetheless, I think we can relate to this one a little bit more directly than the other. So there's quite a few things that we can talk about. But let's start with what's your initial impressions of this novel, of our central character, and how this is being told. Our author as well. All right. Yeah, Gary, go ahead.
It seems that there's always a note of sadness that undercuts all of this. Certainly a note of disappointment, and in quite a few spots, okay, the word betrayal keeps coming up. All right, and thing that seems to be the common denominator of this when I was reading it is the Parnell references.
Right.
That seems to be, even though Parnell has long since passed, okay, could you give some sort of background on Parnell and why everybody feels that he was betrayed? I mean, betrayed by whom? The church, the Irish themselves, the English. I mean, it's kind of an interesting sort of political web. I mean, it's not like I mean, it could be a little bit like the Iliad, okay, in the sense that there's a woman involved in there somewhere, okay, but boy, there just seem to be so many different conflicting loyalties that I don't know. Is there anything that you could help on that, Stephen?
Yeah, Jonathan, did you want to come in on that?
Well, I mean, I don't know a lot. All I know is that he was a parliamentarian, and back in the kind of pretty raucous debates of over home rule, he was kind of emerged as a leading advocate for home rule over the opposition of the Catholic bishops, who I guess also didn't like his personal life. But as I understand it, he failed. I mean, they didn't achieve the actual events were much later when Ireland actually got it. So he was sort of like almost some would say a false messiah. He arose, was going to lead them to freedom, and he didn't. That's all I know.
Yeah, good start. Lisa, what else?
So just to kind of build on what you were saying there, Jonathan, I think what was his ultimate downfall, from what I can understand, is that he ended up having an affair, and it almost seemed like it was with the prime minister's wife or somebody very important's wife. And so the clergy we have, I guess, the Catholicism in Ireland, and then of course, you've got England, which I think is more Protestant or Anglican, so that's also enmeshed here. But so the clergy, I think, was behind him and supporting him. And then when he had this affair and he wanted to get a divorce, or she got a divorce, or no, he got a divorce, I think, that just blew away their support because of their Catholic beliefs, and that's a no-no, and so on and so forth. So I think that is what ultimately caused his downfall, and then that divided the people too. And I think you see that in chapter 1, where Stephen comes home for Christmas dinner, and his family is going at it, and you have the aunt, or Dante, who is very supportive of the clergy, and then you have Stephen's dad and his uncle, who are much more, it sounds like, or feels like, Parnell supporters, and kind of bashing the clergy, that they turned their back on him. I think that's what I got from it.
Yeah, very good. There's a lot in there in what both of you have said. Jonathan, let me come back to you just for a minute. Can you add a little bit to what you mean when you use the word home rule? Can you give a little bit more explanation of that?
I can try. I mean, I could cheat and go to Wiki and read it to you.
No, that's all right.
We went to Dublin on Bloomsday last June, and so we walked some of this, and it was really cool. And I remember we walked through the museum, and Ireland was run as much like Wales or Scotland. It was not just another borough, if you will, of the English, and there was this Republican Irish desire to be in charge of their own fate, and it eventually led to some violence. There was a rebellion, there were people hung in public squares. It was a kind of a pretty messy thing. But the idea of home rule was kind of devolving authority to an Irish parliament to have more control over their lives versus being subservient to primarily what were English, not even Greater Britain, but English politicians.
Good, very nice.
And by the way, that builds on Gary's point about this underlying sense of, what was it you said, Gary? Sadness or
sadness was the word.
Sadness, and there is just a sense of a lingering disappointment.
Yeah, that to me, I think, is in part a result of and a contributor to this political subplot. This idea of just the Irish never being able to fully achieve or be who they want to be.
I guess my question was, who betrayed whom here? I mean, did he betray these different facets of Irish society, or did they betray him, or was it everybody's basically just, turning their back on everybody else?
Gary, be a little more clear when you say who betrayed whom, and then you say he. Who is the he you're referencing?
Parnell. I mean, was it Parnell that betrayed everybody, or did everybody betray Parnell, or was it kind of like, mutual interlocking betrayals? I mean, the church cut him loose, or that he basically cut himself loose from the church. I mean, there's that interesting sort of immorality there, and I know I'm dating myself on this one, but the only politician that I could come up with in my lifetime, would be John Kennedy, the things that have come out about his presidency, over the years, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons for disappointment or loss, but you know what, I mean, 100 years later, as you say, a lot of these things are kept, there's a different perspective, or there's a different, they're seen through a different lens now than they were then, none the least of which, was the involvement of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, when we look at the political and religious context here in Dublin, it's not the same issue, but it almost seems closer to Henry VIII than it does to our time, where the church is so much more involved in what's going in daily life, and in politics, right, in people's lives. Yeah, Mary Jo, go ahead.
I don't think it's that much different, because we today have politicians that may have great positions, but then you find something out about their personal life that's morally unacceptable to our churches or fundamentalist churches or society, and they're gone. So I don't, and some people will say, well, I don't care about their personal life. I support their position, but it still happens today. It's just a different kind of unacceptable behavior today than it was then, I believe.
Yeah, and I think Lisa's point here about at least to anchor this in the novel, that Christmas dinner is so symbolic and reveals so much that we ought to look at some of that, maybe read some of it, talk about the different parts that are there. But I don't want to cut anybody else. Was somebody else coming in here on this? Yeah, Jonathan.
Well,
and Lisa, do you have the page reference where it would be a good place to turn for that? Jonathan and then Kit. Yeah.
Okay, well, I want to change the subject to answer your question about what else did I think about the book. So maybe we finish this and then call on me, because I have a different observation to make.
Okay, yeah, good. Kit, what else?
And I guess this is sort of what I thought about the book, and also this discussion is just us as Stephen kind of being put into this sort of political and social and religious context and climate that we don't currently live in. It's very effective as readers to sort of like piece together, as we're doing now, sort of like, okay, what are these political discussions that we in Stephen's head are kind of observing around the Christmas dinner table? What does this mean, and what does this tell us about the values of the society that we find ourselves in the same way that young Stephen is trying to make sense of the
very good.
he is growing up in.
Yeah, Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, to add to that, I thought the way it was narrated, or is narrated, is very different from certainly the works we've read so far. And it's not narrated by Stephen himself, but in a sense it is, that it's almost being narrated through his perceptions from inside, as opposed to what's happening. It's like, I don't know what's the difference, the internal versus the objective, what's happening on the external to him. And I picked that up right away in the first page. And I was really worried, because as I'm reading about Moo Cow and Taku, and I'm thinking, oh my God, there's no way I'm gonna get through this. And I was really worried, because I'm thinking, God, it's written like almost like a child. And I'm like, oh wait a minute, that's what he's trying to do. I hadn't seen anything like that before. But as he progresses through the book, what's so nice about it is, if you think about like a narrator in some other novels I may have read, the narrator is explaining with really elaborate language what the scene is in a very objective way, as if he's seeing it or she's seeing it in a way better than I could see it myself. Whereas here we're seeing it from inside of himself with all its faults and connections to events he's had in his life. You know, if he sees the color red, he remembers his rose. If he, his feeling, oh, it reminds me of when I, fell in the pond, or, I'm cold like that. And it's very, very interesting, because if you ever try to like reflect on yourself thinking,
right,
that you kind of scatter from one thing to another as you're evaluating a situation, and you're bringing up memories from different situations. And so I found myself, by the time I got into the second book, I'm saying, I really like this, because I'm almost seeing a better picture of what's going on here than I would if I had a narrator that's giving it to me straight, exactly like it happened.
Very good. Very good. Yeah, there's several. Gary, Lisa, Jonathan, I don't know which order we come in. Go ahead, Gary.
Bill, on what Scott was saying, okay, the narration, I think, is it's both the, it really works well here, because you're seeing this through the eyes of a young child, okay, and as such, he's an imperfect narrator, because he tends to focus on not just the subject, okay, of the discussion, but who's generating it. And we've all had experiences that as we've grown older, okay, from childhood on, that some of the big heroes of our past, whether they be parents or those around us, okay, you start seeing them in a suddenly different light, and there's this interesting sort of motif going on here about blindness and vision and clarity of perception and things like that. And so he's seeing things differently. He doesn't quite understand what he's seeing it. He's still processing it, okay? But in the long and short of it, it's causing me as a reader anyway to pretty much do the same there, because you know, looking at this imperfectly from outside of Dublin.
Yeah, good. Lisa.
Well, and Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Joyce was known, and I think he even started this whole stream of consciousness type of writing, which is when I read this, you know, back in high school or whatever, I remember that phrase, and it's sort of to your guys' points. It's like when you're thinking about something, it's just, you know, there's no grammar in how you think. There's no like, oh, here's a thought, you know, period, go on to your next thought. It's like your mind is just kind of a jumble and it goes where it wants to go. And to your point, Scott, one thing tips off and it's that train of thought and you're like, wait a sec, how did I even end up here? And so I think that's what Joyce does here. And to build up what Gary was saying, I mean, you have a very impressionable main character here in Stephen, and you know, he's sitting, again, going back to this dinner, he's sitting at this dinner and, you know, he's got different sides of the family kind of, you know, like screaming at each other. His poor mother is trying to calm everybody down. You have the situation at school where he gets sick because he was pushed in the ditch. And obviously that's going to leave a mark, you know, in terms of something that's going to be with you probably for the rest of your life. So, I agree that this sort of type of stream of consciousness, I think, fits this novel really well, because it shows just how impressionable this young man is and why he grows up to be who he is.
Yeah, maybe just one quick example. I was right there at the ditch on page 11. And maybe if I could just read the two paragraphs, the one that starts in the middle of the page, where he says, they all laughed again. Stephen tried to laugh with them. He felt his whole body hot and confused in a moment. What was the right answer to the question? He had given two and still Wells laughed. But Wells must know the right answer, for he was in third of grammar. He tried to think of Wells's mother, but he did not dare to raise his eyes to Wells's face. He did not like Wells's face. It was Wells who had shouldered him into the square ditch the day before because he would not swap his little snuff box for Wells's seasoned hacking chestnut, the conqueror of 40. It was a mean thing to do. All the fellows said it was. And how cold and slimy the water had been. And a fellow had once seen a big rat jump plop into the scum. The cold slime of the ditch covered his whole body. And when the bell rang for study and the lines filed out of the playrooms, he felt the cold air of the corridor and staircase inside his clothes. He still tried to think what was the right answer. Was it right to kiss his mother or wrong to kiss his mother? What did that mean, to kiss? You put your face up like that to say goodnight, and then his mother put her face down? That was to kiss. His mother put her lips on his cheek. Her lips were soft, and they wetted his cheek, and they made a tiny little noise. Kiss. Why did people do that with their two faces? Let me stop there. Wow. That is so interesting, I think. And especially, this is going to come up again at the end of chapter 2, that I hesitate to look at, but we have to. This is adult material, and I think we are adults, so we get to read it. Mary Jo.
Yeah, this kind of made me think of an overall theme of the instability, and Gary mentioned Parnell, and so he's unstable in his own family life. Everyone arguing about what should be right. The country's unstable. His life at school. He's questioning everything, and he's questioning things that other people don't question, which is very unsettling. and he's small, and you know, it's really hard. I had a lot of empathy for him.
Good. Anyone else? Yeah, Laura.
I think it's like, I think we can all identify with them because we've all been there where you play with older kids and you hear things and don't know why you made something that made them laugh, and you tried to go the other way and they don't catch you. They also laugh at that. It's an extremely identifiable position, and I think that, like we all talked before, the way it's narrated, very introspectively, is what allows us, when we're so far away in time and maybe even understanding of the Catholic Church's role in society, Parnell and all that this allows us to really feel it from his perspective, because I don't think we get it in the sense that we don't have the pressures. And there's many times in what we've been reading, and this passage is one where we don't really, unless you're in his head like that, you're not able to really understand why this really affected him so deeply.
Wow. Yeah, there's so much here. Jonathan, come on in.
Yeah, so I want to build on what Laura just said, because what I was thinking was, again, about the whole book so far. It's not a portrait of Stephen as a young man.
Right.
It's a portrait of the artist, which is somewhat generic.
Right.
So I'm wondering how much it could, and by the way, as of page 109, Stephen hasn't created any art, except he won an essay contest. So he's not even an artist yet. We just get this predestination, much like in the Greek stuff we've read, right? That someday this character is going to go be an artist. And so I kind of read this as James Joyce saying, here's what the early life of an artist looks like and how they feel with that internal dialogue. I made 5 points. I saw 5 points of what are the qualities of an artist as a young man? Observant, distance from immediate experience, so he's set aside to watch it, has a vibrant internal dialogue, that's 3. 4, has an ability to focus on the immediacy of experience so that what's going on in his mind is as real as what's going on in front of him. And finally, this overarching, back to Gary's original point, this overarching sense of self-questioning and yearning. And I thought, put that together, and that is perhaps the alchemical recipe for what makes somebody become an artist. Whether the details of Stephen are interesting, but they're almost inconsequential. They're examples of these bigger themes of what's the kind of stuff that a young person goes through that leads them to become an artist someday. Sort of like Catcher in the Rye with a point.
Look, so that from what Jonathan has said, and there several of y'all want to come in, let me just throw in one little thing, not a little thing, but maybe a big thing. And that is, it seems that Joyce is telling us that all the experiences that we have contribute to our profession, our productivity, our life, but especially as an artist. So and Jonathan, your 5 that you listed, I think are meaningful and interesting. But then there's the other thing that's here that I think Joyce is emphasizing early on, and that is other structures in his life, like family, school, church. What are these? How do they shape Stephen or an artist? These things, why does he spend so much time on these things? They have to be a contribution and not just a incidental. You know, okay, I happen to be born in Kentucky and raised in a Catholic family, somewhat incidental to my life. He doesn't seem to be saying that. He seems to be suggesting that these things are very significant influences in his life. So I would just add that to these other these are interior, these are subjective, whereas those others are exterior. to him and the world in which he is living. Yeah, so there were several of y'all that wanted to get in. Kit, Mary Jo, I think maybe somebody else. Go ahead, Kit.
One
Yeah,
thing
well-
that comes up a lot, and including on page 11, is the inability to find answers within sort of the external structures that he's presented with. I mean, this is a very almost simplistic thing, but is it right to kiss your mother? Yes, no, neither one is like the correct answer. There's something beyond, like there's no norm that will tell him yes or no. And I think that plays out in a lot of the early experiences with politics or with religion, with the church, obviously, with the family. Like none alone is enough to provide him the answers that he needs. So and I think this is something that might be pushing him as an artist as a way to find answers outside of inside rather than in these external.
Good, yeah, good. Yep, Mary Jo, Lorene, and then Mary.
Yeah, with Jonathan's list, what I thought, and this might fit into his list, is the feeling he has of not being mainstream, and I've read that about certain very successful artistic people. Mainly, they're not the center of all they're not the class star and football player, that's the quarterback and the greatest. I'm not articulate today.
Does it have to be a quarterback? What happens to the guard's life?
Who's the star of the school?
The tackles.
Everyone rallies around, and so is that a requirement, or is it, the chicken and the egg? He's questioning, so he's not going to be the center. He's not going to be answering because he questions, like Kit was saying. No one else is questioning.
Lorene and Mary, and then Mary. Sorry.
I relate very personally to Stephen with the crazy internal dialogue that's constant, that makes it hard for me often to express myself. So I really understand him. And what I thought Stephen's characteristics were good, really did describe traits of Stephen. And when you say, Stephen, that these outside forces, how do they affect him, and that they're a big concentration in the book so far, I would think any outside, because he's so hypersensitive and observant and kind of, questioning and vigilant about his own, ability to understand things. I think whatever the outside forces would be important to him. So I think they're very important, but I think it's in part because of who he is. So that if somebody else had the same church and the same schools and the same family, they might have a very different reaction.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's a good point to make, that somebody else within the same context could have different responses and reactions. That's a nice point to make. But in addition, I would say that those influences are still going to be strong influences. The church and the family are almost, the family responds in different ways to the church, but the church is this really high-minded authority structure that stands over everything that's going on. And then the question is, where does the family fit into the church? Is the family outside of the church, or does the family fit into the church? And where does the individual, is the individual within the family, within the church, or is the individual outside of the family but in the church? So the different combinations of things, I think, obviously, Lorene, I agree that they would produce different experiences or different thoughts in different people, so that Stephen is unique. However, I do think that there are common reactions that these kinds of structures affect in a young person. So it gets a little complicated there. Mary, what else?
Well, I guess I started off by thinking, why are we reading this with the Odyssey? And
Yes,
so
good.
they're both coming of age stories, very different coming of age stories. And what was most striking to me is in the passages we read, is his, well, it's a portrayal of a boy coming of age too, of course. So there are different portrayals of what it means to be masculine in this book, how men exist within this culture. And of course, his struggle with sexuality and physicality is just palpable and overwhelming. And I think that's the importance too of the Parnell story and in the discussion of the Catholic Church, is because and the passage we read, he's just struggling with it at every single point. And you see discussions of, is it okay to kiss his mother? I mean, I don't know where this exists in the context of Sigmund Freud, but all of these, or Oedipus, but is it okay to kiss his mother? And then we end book 2, of course, with him kissing the prostitute and his
Yes.
struggles with sexuality and what's okay and priests, and it's all just swirling around him. It was agonizing to read book 2 because you just want to scream, go for it, or something. But of course, this is a different culture. This isn't the Iliad. It's not, Odysseus, with a very different relationship to sex. And the portrayals of women here too. I mean, the portrayals of women are you've got the mother, you've got Dante, you've got the prostitute, you have his girlfriend. And I know it's not about women as these things are, but his they're not fully people, and he struggles with that too, because because that's part of growing up, of course, and it's part of learning how to deal with the other sex, but it's of course being embedded in that Catholic culture, as I understand it, where things are fraught. It's not straightforward, right?
Yeah, good. Because I did read that section on the kissing his mother, and what is it? And he's discovering what a kiss is for the first time. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the end of book 2, because I think it's worth going to there and reading that last part and bringing these two shall I say, these two kisses together. And I'm not going to read the first part. At the bottom of page 107, the first part, there, it's the prostitute and so on. The bottom of page 107, so he says, his lips would not bend to kiss her. He wanted to be held firmly in her arms, to be caressed slowly, slowly, slowly. In her arms, he felt that he had suddenly become strong and fearless and sure of himself. But his lips would not bend to kiss her. With a sudden movement, she bowed his head and joined her lips to his, and he read the meaning of her movements in her frank, uplifted eyes. It was too much for him. He closed his eyes, surrendering himself to her, body and mind, conscious of nothing in the world but the dark pressure of her softly parting lips. They pressed upon his brain as upon his lips, as though they were the vehicle of a vague speech, and between them he felt an unknown and timid pressure, darker than the swoon of sin, softer than sound or odor. Wow.
Wow.
Yeah. What do you make of this? I think this really captures much of what we've been talking about so far. Lisa, yeah.
Well, there's this idea of the dynamics of a kiss representing, it can represent sexuality, but then it can also be asexual, right? So you have a kiss with this prostitute in this sexual situation, but when you're kissing your mother or your family, it's not. So as a child, it's kind of, and especially once you kind of lump in especially in Catholicism, these are things you don't talk about. You just know that certain things are a sin. You don't do things before you're married. You don't, but yet it's never discussed. So you kind of have to figure it out on your own. And sometimes your friends give you good information and sometimes they don't. And so I just think this is a great ending here because well, it's not quite an ending, but it's these different ideas are kind of coming together for him in terms of just what different things can mean and how you learn and understand that, you know, in your life when nobody's telling you and you can't ask directly.
Yeah, very nice. Scott, the only thing, Lisa, that I would add to that is, and you already intimated at it, I would think that every child goes through some of what we've been talking about and has some kind of internalizing. But I'm going to come back to what you suggested is the influence of the church is, for those who weren't raised Catholic, it might be hard for you to fully appreciate what Joyce is doing here. The influence of the church is all encompassing, and yet he is still he's still living his life in his modern world and having this coming of age experience. All the while, the all-encompassing authority of the church lingers in his house and in his head. There's a lot to that. Laura, please.
I'm Catholic. I was raised Catholic, and I really don't have as much of an appreciation from that perspective. But my mother and father, what they were raised, I really can feel this, and so I do know exactly what you're talking about, or at least closer to it than I might think someone who hasn't been raised Catholic. And I think what you're seeing too, in like that moment when finally he, you know, lets go, is he's been very isolated. I think, you know, Lisa said it and Kit said something. It's a very isolating experience. He has no one to talk with. And you see that that's one of the, I think, themes here is he doesn't know who to go to talk about the kiss, or can he go to mom and find out what, you know, sexuality, and it's all a no, you do not talk about that. It's
Right.
very, you know, taboo. So it's a very oppressive situation he's in. And it's, I think that's what we're seeing too in a lot of this.
Scott, go ahead, and then we'll come over. Mary Jo, I think, yeah.
I was just going to say, as all these comments were being made, I thought of the word confusion as I read. First of all, I wasn't raised Catholic, and you know, I observed, you know, some differences in the, you know, you know, I was raised in a you know, Christian home, but not Catholic home, and confusion is the word that I can point to as I was reading through this. And an example of that was when they're at the dinner table and his father is defending Purnell, and Dante, who I think was a nun, was defending the church in a very vehement way. And so he's observing this, and that's where it struck me, is that he's like, well, which one is right? You know, no one's telling me, you know, Dad's saying it, but then Dante's saying it. Dante kind of half brought me up as well. So I don't really know what to do here. And throughout the story, he's kind of being faced with a situation where he's seeing multiple examples. So he's confused. And then he says, well, he doesn't say it, but basically, what do you do when you don't have someone telling you? You have to experiment. And that's kind of what he's going through. So I can imagine it's like experimenting with his religion, but then experimenting with, you know, anti-religion in a sense. And he's got to find out which way to go. Yeah.
Mary Jo, what else?
Yeah, I think one other thing is that there's really feels like there's no separation of church and state here. So it's not only your religion, but it's your government. The bishops are influencing the government. So it's much more than what we have, even if for people that grew up in a Catholic neighborhood in the city of Chicago, where they describe where you live by a parish name. You know,
Right.
I'm sure it felt like that, but this is even more when your government's involved.
Yeah, very good. I'm glad you mentioned that idea of parish, because that adds that I didn't say that. I didn't include that. You know, the parish more than likely your neighbors are going to the same church and you're growing up, with the same people in the same parish. That's another layer that's external to Stephen that is nonetheless a very strong influence upon him. Somewhat, yes, Rita.
So when you're, as Mary, was it Mary Jo? Who
Mary
said,
Jo, yeah.
when you're raised in a parish or a neighborhood that happens to be Catholic, you get that heavy emotional baggage from everywhere when you're being raised like that, right?
Right.
I imagine he must have really struggled with his childlike curiosity, his he wanting to follow what his mom and her religious views were, or being apologetic and being guilt-ridden sometimes, and just not ever able to, at this point, to really fully experience and enjoy his life without having some type of conscience, that was dictated by his mom, but then given kind of an irresponsible kind of way of life or dictated by his father. And so to me, that kind of shows where when you're raised in a family where your father doesn't go to church, but your mother goes to church, or your father doesn't have necessarily the same religious views, then that could be a cause for confusion. That's kind of what it sounds like.
A little bit, huh? Mary, what else?
And I would appreciate your thoughts on this, Stephen, because it seems like the Catholicism might accentuate his conflict over sex and his own sexuality and having physical relationships outside of marriage potentially. But maybe it's more generally Christian, because he's so removed from his body, and the words that he uses to describe these very natural physical impulses. I'm just looking down at the book. It says an echo of an obscene scrawl which he had read on an oozing wall of a urinal, right? So here we have things that are physical he equates to the oozing wall of a urinal. And it's just really powerful. You read this and you think, wow, we've really screwed ourselves up, haven't we? That there's so much conflict in that.
There is conflict in it. And I'm not sure that I can add anything more than other people could, other than to say that that at least the Catholic Church, the human sexuality is, or was, especially in his day, something that wasn't discussed. And not discussed by the church, and not discussed by and not so much in the family either. And that you're pretty much left to figure that out on your own. But his way of coming to it is really sensual. He seems to be quite sensitive to the senses, right? His senses, or put it in a different way, his senses are heightened. And Mary, that passage that you read, that could be described in so many different ways, but he chose to describe it in the way that he did. It's almost, I would say it's artful and pornographic at the same time. Because, let's remember, he's standing at the urinal. And there are fluids oozing from his body. And he doesn't tell us what image it is or anything like that, but he's fully aware of that, and he brings those things together in this way that he describes it. And I think he does that throughout the novel. That he is, I'd say his senses are very alert. His observation is keen, but it's not analytical, it's not rational. You'd say it's experiential, and it is, yeah, I would just say it's experiential. Let me just stop with there. There's probably more that I could say, but I think that's probably sufficient. So let me stop there for anybody else. And maybe, Lisa, we should get that Christmas scene. Can you point us to the page? I was looking
Well,
at.
it starts around around 28, 29, and it goes all the way to like 38.
Yeah, good. But let's pick up on some of that. Maybe with. I'm trying to find it where we could start with a good description. It was his first Christmas dinner, the bottom of page 28, maybe, and the paragraph up into 29. It was his first Christmas dinner, and he thought of his little brothers and sisters who were waiting in the nursery, as he had often waited till the pudding came. The deep low collar and the Eton jacket made him feel queer and oldish. And that morning, when his mother had brought him down to the parlor, dressed for Mass, his father had cried. That was because he was thinking of his own father, and Uncle Charles had said so too. And it goes on from there. How does this little description get this thing started? What's here in this paragraph?
Well, I think it just, I mean, this is his first time at what is essentially sort of the adult table.
Yes.
The kids are obviously, the other younger kids, you're removed. You know, you're at the kids' table, right? When you're at Christmas dinner or Thanksgiving dinner, he's now reached an age where he is having his first dinner with the adults, and he's going to then be able to listen. And he already feels kind of weird about it because he's in this different dress, and he was going to Mass, and his father got upset, which, you know, it's again, we talked a little bit about masculinity earlier. You know, so there's emotions here that he's not used to within himself and within observing in others, like his father. Not to mention, you know, the adult political and religious talk that we're about to get into, our arguments that we're about to get into.
Yeah, good, very good, thank you. Laureen, what else?
Yeah, you know, it's a rite of passage, him coming to the table. I mean, they dressed him for it, and Dad has this reaction. But it's interesting. It's an extreme change. He was part of the kids, and now he's going and it's just adults. There's no other older sibling to shepherd him. He's it. So it's a big change from the year before.
Very good. A big change. Kit, were you going to come in here?
No.
Okay. Okay, so let's pick up anything else at this Christmas table, because it goes on. This is perhaps the single focus in at least in book one. Laureen, what else? Yeah.
I was going to mention, you know, when you said that his aunt, Dante, I don't know, is Dante his aunt? Dante is is a nun. I thought so too, but then I think she was going to be a nun, but then somebody left her money. Her name is Mrs. Reardon. I was a little unclear, but I think, or maybe her husband, somebody left her. I read that somewhere and I was looking for it.
It was a brother. I think her brother left her money, or a cousin, a brother or a cousin, something like that. But
then she ended up marrying, right? After that, her last name's her name's Mrs. Reardon. So I didn't. So anyway, that's an interesting complexity because she's very much for the church, and she was going to be a nun, but she didn't take her vows, it seems.
I hate to be too biographical here. My aunt was a nun, but left the convent and got married. So this is terrible for me. Reading this is just, Stephen, every time Stephen, and then the aunt who's thinking about the convent, and I had an aunt who was in the convent and then left. But anyway, that's another point. Scott, you were going to come in on this.
Well, just I think this is kind of emblematic of the way the story's going. Is he's making these various incremental stages in his life, making his way through it, various incremental stages in life. So now he's coming to the big table, doesn't really know what it means, and all of a sudden it's at a completely different level because you got these adults arguing, and
Right.
you know, he doesn't understand these arguments. He doesn't understand why adults would argue. The adults are saying some things that he probably never would have thought they would say. And he's seeing an interaction between Dante and his father in a way that he probably never saw before, and his uncle. And so he's again completely confused. Oh my gosh, you know, every time I get older, I gotta learn something new, and it's not usually a good thing. You know, it seems that way. It goes through the story.
Every stage I moved, every step I take closer to adulthood, the more complex and strange the world becomes. I'm looking at the bottom of page 34. Oh my gosh, it's time. Whoa, we're out of time. I just looked at the clock. I better stop here. So I think do we finish? Well, we don't finish the book. We have 2 more weeks in the book. Yeah, good. We have 2 more weeks. Only 1 more. We got to finish it next week?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. All right. We got to do the whole thing next week. Okay. Well, I think we're off to a great start. Thank you all for all your participation and observations. It's a pleasure to read good literature with intelligent, willing adults participate. So have a good break. We'll see you next week, and we'll take on the whole of the portrait of the artist. Okay,
Thank you,
bye-bye.
Stephen. Have a good week. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.